In the winter of 1897, in a cramped records office beneath the newly rebuilt Chicago City Hall, a municipal clerk sorting through salvaged census documents from the previous decade discovered something that contradicted the official narrative of the city's recovery. The pages, water-stained and brittle, carried an odor of damp earth and mold. Outside, February wind rattled the frosted windows. The clerk, a man named Samuel Henning, had been tasked with reconciling population figures for a routine administrative report. What he found instead was absence, not the kind that follows disaster, but the kind that follows erasure. The 1890 census listed 1.8 million residents in Chicago and its immediate environs. The 1900 census, conducted just months before, reported barely 1.7 million. Between those years lay the catastrophic flooding of 1891 through 1893, events the newspapers had described as temporary disruptions caused by unprecedented rainfall and poor drainage. Yet the numbers suggested something else entirely. 100,000 people, perhaps more, had simply vanished from the records. No mass graves, no emigration logs, no explanation in any official capacity. Henning made a marginal note in pencil on his worksheet. Discrepancy requires investigation. The note was crossed out 3 days later, not by Henning, but by his supervisor, in red ink. The report was filed without amendment. The flooding had arrived in stages, beginning in late March of 1891. Contemporary newspapers described streets transformed into canals, basements filled to the ceiling, entire commercial districts submerged under 3 to 7 feet of brown sediment-thick water that smelled of clay and industrial runoff. Photographs from that period show horse-drawn carriages abandoned mid-street, wheels buried to the axles. Pedestrians navigate wooden planks laid across intersections. Storefronts display water lines, at chest height, darkening the brick in horizontal bands. The official explanation attributed the deluge to a combination of factors: record snowmelt from the previous winter, overwhelmed storm sewers, and the inadequacy of the recently completed drainage canal system. Engineers testified before city commissions, presenting charts and hydraulic models. The water, they insisted, would recede. It did, but not before settling into basements, subsurface tunnels, and the lower floors of thousands of buildings across the metropolitan area. What the photographs do not show, and what the newspapers mentioned only in passing, were the neighborhoods that remained submerged long after the initial floods drained away. Entire districts in the industrial zones south and west of the Loop reported persistent water accumulation through 1892 and into early 1893. Residents described pumps running day and night, the rhythmic clank of machinery audible blocks away, and yet the water remained, as if the ground itself refused to absorb it. On the 14th of August, 1892, in a leather-bound logbook kept by the Chicago Department of Public Works, an entry recorded the closure of 17 streets due to continued subsurface instability and standing water hazard. The list included entire residential blocks. The same logbook, archived in the Chicago History Museum, contains a second entry dated 3 weeks later, written in different handwriting. It reads, "Streets cleared, structures condemned, residents relocated per emergency ordinance. No ordinance number is provided. No relocation destination is listed." A researcher examining the logbook in 2003 noted that several pages between these entries had been carefully excised, leaving only the ragged edge of paper along the binding. The cut was clean, deliberate, made with a blade rather than torn. The page numbers skip from 47 to 53. The missing pages have never been recovered. Census takers in the autumn of 1900 encountered an unusual pattern in their interviews. Block after block in former flood zones showed new occupants who had no knowledge of prior residents. When asked about the previous tenants, landlords offered vague responses: moved away, went west, returned to the old country. Yet lease records and property transfers for those same addresses often showed no change of ownership. The buildings had remained in the same hands throughout the 1890s, yet the people who had lived inside them left no forwarding information. City directories from 1891 listed thousands of names: shopkeepers, time equals 300 milliseconds / laborers, clerks, seamstresses. These names simply do not appear in the 1895 or 1900 editions. Genealogical researchers in later decades would search for descendants of these individuals and find nothing. no death certificates, no birth records for children, no marriage licenses. The names existed in the 1891 directory and then ceased to exist in any official capacity. It was as if entire families had been lifted from the city and deposited nowhere. The architectural response to the flooding created its own mysteries. Beginning in 1893, the city embarked on an ambitious program of raising street levels and building foundations, a process that would eventually elevate much of downtown Chicago by as much as 14 feet. The engineering was remarkable. Buildings were jacked up on screw jacks, while new foundations were poured beneath them. Entire blocks were hoisted in unison to maintain level alignment. Photographs document the surreal sight of stores and hotels suspended in mid-air, pedestrians walking beneath them on the old street level while construction crews worked above. Yet this process, which should have taken years, was completed in certain districts with astonishing speed. A theater on State Street was raised 11 feet in 17 days. An entire row of commercial buildings along Wabash Avenue was elevated in less than a month. The techniques used were not recorded in engineering journals of the period. No patents were filed. The contractors involved left minimal documentation. One engineer, writing privately to a colleague in 1896, described the process as unprecedented in its efficiency, though I confess I do not fully comprehend the method by which the supporting apparatus achieved such uniform lift without catastrophic structural failure. By 1895, large sections of the former flood zones had been transformed. The old street level became a subterranean network of passageways, storage rooms, and utility corridors beneath the newly raised streets. These spaces, later popularized as part of Chicago's underground city, were initially sealed off, accessible only through locked grates and maintenance hatches. City ordinances prohibited public access, citing safety concerns, unstable foundations, poor air quality, risk of collapse. Yet workers who maintained gas lines and electrical conduits in these spaces reported finding things that should not have been there. A utility crew in 1897, repairing a broken water main beneath Michigan Avenue, discovered a fully furnished apartment in what had once been a ground-floor residence. The furniture remained in place. Time equals 500 milliseconds greater than table set with plates, coats hanging on hooks, a calendar on the wall showing March 1892. Dust covered everything. The air smelled of damp plaster and something else, something organic and faintly sweet. The crew reported the find to their supervisor, who ordered the space sealed with brick and mortar. The incident appears in a work log but was never investigated further. Across the Atlantic, in the archives of the Royal Geographical Society in London, a letter dated June 1893 describes similar phenomena occurring in other cities during the same period. The letter, written by a civil engineer named Thomas Whitmore, who had recently returned from an assignment in Seattle, mentions catastrophic subsidence and flooding, affecting multiple districts of that city, with entire neighborhoods rendered uninhabitable and subsequently buried beneath fill material brought in by rail. Whitmore notes that local authorities were reluctant to discuss the specifics of the disaster, and that population records showed unexplained gaps. He writes, "I was informed by one official, speaking in confidence, that the displaced residents had been relocated to agricultural settlements in the interior territories, though I saw no documentation to support this claim." Whitmore's letter was filed among routine correspondence and remained unexamined until a graduate student researching 19th century urban disasters stumbled upon it in 2011. The student later attempted to cross-reference Whitmore's account with Seattle municipal records from the same period. The records had been destroyed in a fire in 1927. The pattern extended beyond Chicago and Seattle. In the decade between 1885 and 1895, at least 16 major cities across North America and Europe experienced significant flooding events that resulted in large-scale urban reconstruction. In each case, the official narrative emphasized rapid recovery and modernization. Streets were raised, drainage systems improved, new infrastructure installed. Yet beneath these triumphal accounts of engineering prowess lay the same troubling gaps in documentation. In Nashville, a flood in 1888 submerged the riverfront district for 11 months. When the water finally receded, census records showed a population decline of 15%, despite the city's booming economy and influx of rail commerce. In Johnstown, Pennsylvania, where the catastrophic dam failure of 1889 killed thousands, the official death toll has never fully reconciled with survivor accounts. Witnesses described bodies recovered from the mud weeks and months after the flood, faces preserved in the oxygen-poor silt. Time equals 500 milliseconds, / greater than yet. These recoveries were not added to the official count. The dead were buried in unmarked mass graves, lime poured over them, and the sites were paved over within a year. On a rainy morning in March 1902, in the editorial offices of the Chicago Tribune, a junior reporter named Martin Kellerman pitched a story about the missing flood victims. He had spent 6 months tracing census records, interviewing elderly residents of former flood zones, and collecting discrepancies. His editor, a man with 30 years of experience in Chicago journalism, listened without expression. When Kellerman finished his presentation, the editor asked a single question. Level equals moderate. Who benefits from this story? Kellerman admitted he did not know. The editor leaned back in his chair and said, "Then there is no story." Kellerman's notes and research materials were never published. The materials themselves disappeared from his desk within a week. Kellerman left the newspaper shortly thereafter and took a position writing agricultural reports for a trade publication. He never pursued investigative journalism again. The architectural legacy of the flood-era reconstruction reveals technical anomalies that persist to the present day. Buildings raised during the 1893 to 1896 period exhibit unusual structural features, foundations that extend far, deeper than engineering standards of the time would require, basements sealed with multiple layers of concrete and brick, and ventilation systems that seem designed to prevent air exchange rather than facilitate it. A structural survey conducted in 1978 during the renovation of a historic building on Dearborn Street discovered that the foundation extended 23 feet below the raised street level, terminating in a concrete pad that rested directly on bedrock. This was 11 feet deeper than necessary for a structure of its size and weight. The survey team also noted that the lowest level of the foundation showed evidence of water damage and biological staining, despite being below the water table and theoretically flooded continuously. The stains suggested organic decomposition on a massive scale, though no source could be identified. The findings were noted in the survey report, but did not delay the renovation. The basement levels were sealed again, this time with modern waterproofing, and the building reopened to tenants. In the small town of Pullman, just south of Chicago, a company town built by railroad magnate George Pullman in the 1880s, the flooding of the early 1890s had a different character. The town, designed with careful attention to drainage and sanitation, should have weathered the floods better than the chaotic urban sprawl of Chicago proper. Yet, records from the Pullman Company archives show a dramatic population turnover between 1891 and 1894. Of the 8,600 residents listed in company housing logs in 1890, fewer than 4,000 remained by 1895. The company's official explanation cited labor disputes and economic downturn. However, payroll records show continuous employment throughout this period, with no significant layoffs. The workers had not lost their jobs. They had simply disappeared from the residential rolls. The housing they vacated was filled by new workers, often immigrants recruited from overseas, who arrived with no knowledge of their predecessors. When asked about the former occupants, these new residents reported that the houses had been empty when they arrived, though company maintenance logs showed recent repairs and upkeep. A physician practicing in the Pullman district during this period left a private diary that surfaced in an estate sale in 1967. The diary entries from late 1892 describe an unusual medical phenomenon, a respiratory illness that affected bunds of residents, characterized by persistent cough, difficulty breathing, and a gray discoloration of the skin. The doctor, whose name was redacted from the published excerpts of the diary, noted that the illness seemed to correlate with residents in buildings that had experienced prolonged basement flooding. He wrote, "The afflicted speak of dreams, vivid, recurring, in which they are submerged, unable to breathe, yet unable to drown. They describe a pressure, a weight, as if the earth itself were pressing down upon them." The doctor attempted to report the outbreak to public health authorities but received no response. The illness disappeared from his records after January 1893. The patients who had suffered from it were no longer listed in his practice register. The diary does not explain where they went. By 1905, Chicago had completed its transformation into a modern metropolis. The raised streets, the expanded rail network, the monumental architecture of the world's Columbian Exposition's legacy, all spoke to a city reborn from catastrophe. Yet beneath this gleaming surface, the subterranean levels remained, largely forgotten. Access points were bricked over, maps of the old street grid removed from public circulation, and the history of the floods reduced to a footnote in official histories. When journalists or historians inquired about the discrepancies in population records, they were directed to explanations involving immigration patterns, transcription errors, and the general chaos of 19th century record-keeping. These explanations were accepted, filed, and forgotten. In 1976, during the construction of a new subway line beneath the Loop, excavation crews broke through a brick wall and discovered a sealed chamber that had once been the basement of a residential building. The chamber was dry, despite being below the water table. Inside, the crew found remnants of domestic life frozen in time: furniture, clothing, kitchen implements, children's toys. Everything was covered in a fine layer of gray sediment that crumbled at the touch. The construction foreman ordered the chamber photographed and then filled with concrete as part of the subway foundation. The photographs were archived at the Chicago Transit Authority and are not available for public viewing. A crew member who spoke anonymously to a local reporter years later described the scene as like Pompeii, but without the bodies. When asked where the residents might have gone, the worker said, "Nowhere, that's the thing. It looked like they just stopped existing right there." On a cold afternoon in November 2019, a graduate student in urban archaeology at Northwestern University named Elena Vasquez was researching the history of Chicago's underground for her dissertation. She had obtained permission to access restricted sections of the old tunnels beneath downtown, accompanied by a city maintenance supervisor. As they walked through the brick-lined passages, their flashlights revealing archways and sealed doorways, the supervisor mentioned casually that certain areas of the underground were still off-limits, even to maintenance crews. When Vasquez asked why, the supervisor shrugged and said, "Structural instability, officially, but the old-timers, the guys who've worked down here for 30, 40 years, they say it's because some of those sealed sections still have air quality problems. They say the air down there doesn't move right. It's heavy. Makes you short of breath." Vasquez asked if anyone had investigated. The supervisor shook his head. "Not our department. Historical preservation, maybe. Or nobody. Some things you just leave alone." The dissertation Vasquez eventually completed focused on the architectural history of the raising of Chicago, with only a brief mention of the population discrepancies and sealed chambers. Her advisor had suggested that speculation about missing residents would undermine the scholarly credibility of her work. Vasquez included footnotes referencing the census gaps and the sealed spaces, but offered no conclusions. The dissertation was accepted without controversy. She now works as a consultant for urban development projects and does not discuss the sealed chambers in interviews. The question persists, unanswered and largely unasked. Where did they go? 100,000 people, perhaps more, across multiple cities during a decade of catastrophic floods and rapid reconstruction. The official records offer emigration, relocation, transcription error, yet the evidence suggests something else: a systematic absence, a removal so thorough that it left almost no trace. No mass graves were ever found. No emigrant ships carried passenger lists matching the missing names. No frontier settlements reported sudden influxes of refugees from the flooded cities. Thus, people simply ceased to appear in any record, as if they had been erased not just from the city, but from history itself. Modern technology has allowed researchers to map the subterranean spaces beneath cities like Chicago with ground-penetrating radar and sonar imaging. These surveys reveal extensive networks of sealed chambers, tunnels, and voids that do not correspond to any known infrastructure. Some of these spaces are massive, cathedral-like caverns beneath the footprint of what were once residential neighborhoods. The surveys cannot determine what, if anything, these spaces contain. They remain sealed, access points lost or deliberately obscured. City governments cite safety concerns and budget limitations. Time equals 450 milliseconds when asked about excavation or investigation. The spaces appear on engineering maps as filled or stabilized, though the scans suggest otherwise. In a dusty box in the basement of the Newberry Library, a researcher in 2014 discovered a collection of letters written by survivors of the Chicago floods. The letters, dated between 1893 and 1897, were written to family members who had disappeared during the flood years. The writers described searching for loved ones, visiting supposed relocation camps that did not exist, petitioning city officials who offered no information. One letter, written by a woman named Catherine Dwyer in 1894, describes her search for her husband and two children who had last been seen in their home on West Harrison Street as the floodwaters rose in March 1892. She wrote, "I am told they were taken to safety, but no record exists of where. I am told I am mistaken, that they left the city of their own accord, but their belongings remain in our home. I am told to stop asking, that my inquiries disturb the peace. I do not know where they have gone, or if they went anywhere at all." The letter was never mailed. It remained in Catherine Dwyer's papers, along with dozens of others like it. Dwyer herself disappears from city records in 1896. The pattern of disappearance was not random. Analysis of the census data and city directories shows that the missing came disproportionately from the poorest districts, the most recently arrived immigrant communities, the areas with the least political representation. These were the neighborhoods that remained flooded longest, where the water pooled in basements and ground floors, where the sediment settled thick and gray. These were the areas that were raised first in the reconstruction, the old street levels buried deepest, the access points most thoroughly sealed. If there was a logic to the erasure, it was the logic of convenience. Time equals 600 milliseconds, the removal of those whose absence would be noticed least, whose voices carried no weight, whose disappearance could be attributed to the natural churn of urban life. Today, developers in Chicago occasionally uncover remnants of the old city during construction projects. A basement reveals itself during foundation excavation. A sealed tunnel is breached while laying new water mains. Each time, the protocol is the same: document, photograph, fill with concrete, continue construction. The historical preservation boards review the photographs and file them. The concrete sets. The city rises higher. The past is buried deeper. The official narrative holds. Chicago recovered from disaster and emerged stronger. The missing are explained as emigrants, as record-keeping errors, as the inevitable gaps in 19th century documentation. Yet the evidence accumulates in archives and forgotten files, in marginal notes and crossed-out entries, in the spaces between what is documented and what is remembered. The 100,000 who vanished left echoes, not in monuments or official histories, but in the absence itself, in the sealed chambers beneath the streets, in the census records that do not align, in the letters that were never answered. History is written by survivors, we are told, but what if survival itself was selective? What if the floods were not merely natural disasters, but opportunities for a kind of systematic erasure? A remaking of the city that required the removal of those deemed inconvenient to the new vision? The question remains unanswered because it remains largely unasked. The sealed spaces beneath Chicago wait, undisturbed, their contents unknown. The missing remain missing, their names recorded in ledgers that no one reads, their faces captured in photographs, filed in boxes that no one opens. And the city above continues its life, unaware or unconcerned that beneath its foundations lies a silence that has never been explained. If history is written by survivors, time equals 600 milliseconds, then the mud floods wrote a history in absence, a story told not in what remains, but in what was removed, not in monuments, but in erasures, not in answers, but in questions that were never allowed to be asked.